He signed the papers with a smirk, treating our divorce like a ticket to freedom. I did not cry. I simply placed a sealed envelope on the table, and the air in the room turned instantly frigid. His smile vanished when the judge read the company name. Realizing it was his employer, the shock was not that I controlled a $150 billion empire, but that I had sat in the very meetings deciding his fate for 7 years. My name is Mackenzie Murphy, and for the last hour, I had been watching my husband dismantle our marriage with the same casual indifference he used to order room service. The mediation room inside the courthouse smelled of lemon polish and old leather, a scent that failed to mask the sterile, freezing air pumping from the vents above. It was deliberate, I was sure. They kept these rooms cold to hurry people along, to make the discomfort of staying greater than the pain of conceding. Blake sat across the mahogany table, looking every inch the corporate rising star he believed himself to be. His suit was charcoal, tailored to perfection, the cuffs shooting exactly half an inch past his jacket sleeves. He did not look at me. He looked at the documents spread before him, his pen hovering with an impatience that set my teeth on edge. To him, I was not a wife anymore. I was a calendar invite that had run over its allotted time. He signed the final page of the divorce decree with a flourish, the scratch of the expensive fountain pen echoing in the quiet room. He capped it with a sharp click and slid the papers toward the center of the table, leaning back in his chair with a sigh that was meant to convey exhaustion but only signaled relief. "There, it is done," he said, finally deigning to look at me. His eyes were devoid of any shared history. There was no memory of our honeymoon in the Alps, no recollection of the nights I stayed up helping him rehearse his presentations until 3 a.m. There was only the look of a man cutting loose dead weight, Judge Renee Caldwell, a woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen every variety of human deceit, reached for the papers. Before she could pull them closer, Blake spoke again. "I want the record to reflect that I am being generous," Blake said, his voice smooth, practiced. He was performing. He was always performing. Mackenzie has not contributed financially to this household in 7 years. She has no career. She has no assets. I am agreeing to this settlement not because she earned it, but because I want to ensure she has enough time to find a job, any job, though I suspect the adjustment from being a passenger to actually driving her own life will be difficult. My hands were folded in my lap. I squeezed my left thumb with my right hand, feeling the indentation where my engagement ring used to sit. I had taken it off that morning. The skin there was pale, a ghost of a commitment that had died long before today. I remained silent. It was a silence that took effort. Inside my chest, a scream was building, a primal rejection of his narrative. I wanted to list the dinners I hosted to charm his clients. I wanted to detail the social maneuvering I had done to get him introduced to the right partners at the firm, but I swallowed it down. If I spoke now, I would sound like the bitter ex-wife he was already painting me to be. My lawyer, Alyssa Grant, shifted beside me. Alyssa was the kind of attorney who did not need to raise her voice to be heard. She wore a suit that cost more than Blake's car, though he would never know enough about high fashion to realize it. She placed a hand gently on my forearm, a silent signal. It was time. Alyssa reached into her briefcase. The sound of the zipper was sharp, slicing through the low hum of the air conditioning. She withdrew a single, thick envelope. It was cream-colored, heavy stock, sealed with red wax that bore a crest Blake would not recognize, but one that would soon haunt him. "Your Honor," Alyssa said, her tone conversational but firm, "before you certify this dissolution, there is an additional document that must be entered into the record." Blake let out a short, incredulous laugh. He checked his watch, a platinum chronograph he had bought with his last bonus. "Come on, Alyssa," Blake said, shaking his head. "We have been negotiating for 6 months. We are done. I have a strategy meeting at Crestfall Realty in 45 minutes, a meeting that actually matters. I cannot be late because Mackenzie wants to drag this out for attention." He turned to me, his expression softening into a mockery of pity. "Mackenzie, look at me. It is over. You do not have to create drama just to keep me in the room. You need to move on. Find a hobby. Join a book club. Just let me get back to work. I looked at him then. Really looked at him. I saw the arrogance that had calcified over his soul. He truly believed he was the sun around which my small, insignificant world revolved. He thought I was helpless. He thought I was destitute. He thought he was the architect of his own success. I did not blink. I did not frown. I simply stared at him with a gaze so flat and heavy that he faltered. Just for a second. Submit the document. Alyssa, I said. My voice was steady. It did not shake. Alyssa slid the envelope across the polished table toward Judge Caldwell. This is a disclosure of assets regarding my client, Alyssa stated. Specifically, an inheritance that was finalized 72 hours ago, triggered by a clause in the estate planning of the late Evelyn Murphy. Blake rolled his eyes, throwing his hands up. Oh, great. What is it? Her mother's antique spoon collection? A timeshare in Florida? Blake scoffed, checking his watch again. Your Honor, unless this inheritance significantly alters the marital assets, which I doubt. Considering her mother lived in a rented condo, can we please expedite this? I really have to go. Judge Caldwell ignored him. She picked up the envelope. She broke the wax seal. The crack of the wax was loud in the room. She pulled out the document, a sheaf of legal papers bound in blue backing. The judge adjusted her glasses. She began to read. At first, her expression was neutral, the professional mask of a jurist who had seen it all. But as her eyes scanned the first page, her brow furrowed. She stopped. She looked closer, as if she had misread a word. She flipped to the second page, then the third, her reading pace accelerating. The room went silent. The only sound was the air conditioner and the rapid rustling of pages as Judge Caldwell moved through the document. Blake was tapping his foot. He pulled out his phone under the table, likely checking his email, completely dismissing the gravity of the silence that had befallen the bench. I looked down at my hands again. I thought about the meeting Blake was rushing to, the strategy meeting. I knew the agenda of that meeting. I knew the agenda because I had approved it 3 days ago. I knew who would be there. I knew the budget cuts they were discussing. I knew it all because while Blake was playing the big shot in middle management, I was the one reading the board minutes. I was the one approving his bonuses. Judge Caldwell stopped reading. She slowly lowered the papers to the desk. She took off her glasses and set them down on top of the file. She looked at me, a flicker of something like shock or perhaps respect passing through her eyes. Then, she turned her gaze toward Blake. It was not a friendly look. It was the look one might give a man standing on train tracks who is too busy checking his reflection in a mirror to hear the whistle. Mr. Sterling, Judge Caldwell said. Her voice had dropped an octave. It was serious, deadly serious. Blake did not look up from his phone immediately. Yes, Your Honor. Is there a problem with the spoons? Judge Caldwell did not smile. She rested her hand on the document, her fingers splaying over the text as if to physically hold back the weight of what was written there. Mr. Sterling, the judge repeated, and this time the sharpness in her tone made Blake snap his head up. He frowned. Sensing the shift in the atmosphere, the air in the room seemed to have grown heavier, charged with static. You mentioned you are in a rush to get to your office, Judge Caldwell said. You work for Crestfall Realty Group. Is that correct? Blake straightened his tie, looking confused but still arrogant. Yes, I am a senior director there. It is a subsidiary of a major holding company. It is a very demanding role. The judge nodded slowly. She looked down at the paper again, specifically at a line near the top of the preamble. And you are under the impression that your wife has no financial standing, that she has been, as you put it, a passenger. Facts are facts, Your Honor, Blake said, his patience thinning. Judge Caldwell picked up the document again. She held it up, the blue backing catching the fluorescent light. She looked at Blake with an expression that was almost pitying, but edged with the cold steel of the law. Mr. Sterling, she said, her eyes locking onto his. Do you want to hear this part? Judge Caldwell did not rush. She seemed to understand that the words she was about to speak would alter the gravity of the room, perhaps even the gravity of Blake's entire universe. She adjusted the document on the desk, smoothing the paper with a deliberate, slow motion that made Blake huff in annoyance. He checked his watch again, a gesture that was now purely performative. "Read it, Your Honor," Blake said, waving a hand dismissively. "Let us get to the part where I'm supposed to be impressed by a few savings bonds or a hidden bank account with $5,000 in it. I really do have a business to run." The judge looked over the rim of her glasses, her eyes locking onto him with a sharpness that should have warned him. "The document states that your wife, Mackenzie Murphy, is the sole beneficiary of the Evelyn Murphy estate," Judge Caldwell read, her voice clear and devoid of emotion. Evelyn Murphy was the founder, chairwoman, and majority shareholder of a private equity firm known as Murphy Dominion Holdings. Blake blinked. The name hung in the air, foreign and unimpressive to him. He let out a short, dry chuckle, shaking his head as he looked at Alyssa. "My lawyer, Murphy Dominion Holdings," Blake repeated, tasting the words like they were stale bread. "I have been in finance and real estate for a decade. I have never heard of it. What is that?" "Some LLC she set up to manage a couple of rental properties in Ohio." He turned to me, his smile wide and condescending. "Is that the big secret?" "Mac, your mom was a landlord. That is cute, really. I am sure the rental income will help with your grocery bills." I said nothing. I only watched him. It was fascinating, in a morbid way, to watch a man standing on a trapdoor while mocking the lever. Judge Caldwell cleared her throat. The sound was like a gavel strike. "Mr. Sterling, if you would let me finish," she said, her tone dropping to a freezing temperature. "Murphy Dominion Holdings is a legacy conglomerate. They do not advertise because they do not need to. They operate as the parent company for 17 major subsidiaries across North America." Blake leaned back, crossing his arms. He still did not get it. He looked bored. "Okay, so she owns a piece of a parent company nobody knows." "Great. Can I go now?" The judge ignored him. She looked back at the paper, her finger tracing the list of assets. Among the subsidiaries fully owned and controlled by Murphy Dominion Holdings are MD Logistics, Sovereign Steel, the Ridley Hotel chain. And she paused. It was a pause that lasted a lifetime. She looked up from the paper, staring directly at the logo embroidered on the left breast of Blake's expensive suit jacket and the Crestfall Realty Group. The silence that followed was absolute. It was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a vacuum, sucking the oxygen out of Blake's lungs. Blake sat frozen. His mouth was slightly open, prepared to make another witty remark, but the words died in his throat. His eyes went wide, not with understanding, but with a sudden, violent cognitive dissonance. His brain was trying to reject the information. "Crestfall," he whispered. The word came out like a question, weak and trembling. That was his world. Crestfall Realty Group was the titan of the industry. It was the logo on his business cards. It was the brand on the sign behind him in every LinkedIn profile picture. It was the company he bragged about at dinner parties. The corporate identity he had wrapped himself in like a security blanket. Judge Caldwell nodded. "Yes, Crestfall Realty Group. The entity you work for. The entity you claim to be too busy to stay in this courtroom for." Blake laughed nervously. It was a high-pitched, jagged sound. "That is impossible. Crestfall is a global leader. It is massive." Mackenzie's mom. She was a librarian. She baked cookies. She wore cardigans. She was a silent partner. I said, my voice cut through his panic. It was the first time I had spoken in 20 minutes. Blake's head snapped toward me. He looked at me as if he had never seen me before, and in a way, he had not. He had seen a housewife. He had seen a prop. He had never seen the daughter of Evelyn Murphy. She retired from public operations 15 years ago. I continued, keeping my voice low and steady. She preferred anonymity. She hated the spotlight. But she never gave up control. She built Murphy Dominion from the ground up. Blake, and she never sold a single share. Judge Caldwell resumed reading, her voice relentless. According to the terms of the trust, upon the passing of Evelyn Murphy and the subsequent processing period, full controlling interest of Murphy Dominion Holdings, and by extension, all subsidiaries including Crestfall Realty, Transferred to Mackenzie Murphy exactly 72 hours ago. The judge looked up, her eyes hard. Mr. Sterling, the valuation of the assets your wife now controls is estimated at $150 billion. The number hit him physically. Blake slumped back in his chair. 150 billion. It was a number so large it was abstract, yet its weight was crushing him. He looked at his hands. He looked at the divorce papers sitting in the center of the table. The papers he had just signed. Wait, Blake stammered. He looked at Alyssa, then at the judge, then at me. His face was pale, a sickly gray color replacing his earlier flush of confidence. Wait a minute. 72 hours ago, I leaned forward. I placed my elbows on the table and clasped my hands, mirroring the pose he usually took when he was negotiating a deal he thought he had already won. You always asked me what I did on Tuesdays. Blake, do you remember? You used to make jokes about it. You told your friends I was at a book club, or getting my nails done, or wasting time. Blake swallowed hard. I could see his Adam's apple bob. I was not at a book club, I said softly, for the last 7 years. Every Tuesday. I was in the boardroom on the 42nd floor of the Murphy Dominion Tower. I was sitting in on the oversight meetings. I was reviewing the quarterly reports for Crestfall. I was listening to the regional directors present their strategies. I paused, letting the information sink in. I was sitting 10 feet away from the speakerphone when you called in to beg for that budget increase last November. I was the one who motioned to approve it. Blake looked like he was going to be sick. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an exit, for a restart button, for anything that would make this a nightmare he could wake up from. You were there, he whispered. I was always there. I replied. You just never looked up high enough to see me. The realization washed over him. Every complaint he had made about his incompetent bosses at the dinner table, every time he had mocked the invisible board for their strict policies, every time he had come home and treated me like I could not possibly understand the complexities of his job, I had been there. I had been the one signing off on the policies he hated. I had been the one protecting his job when his numbers dipped 2 years ago. He stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. Your Honor, he said, his voice rising in panic. I did not know. This changes things. This changes everything. This is a material fact that was withheld. He reached for the settlement agreement in the center of the table. His hand was shaking. I withdraw my signature, Blake said, his voice cracking. We need to renegotiate. I want to rescind the agreement. We have to discuss spousal support. We have to discuss community property. I did not know she was my boss. He grabbed the corner of the document. Judge Caldwell's hand slammed down onto the table. It was not a violent slam, but it was authoritative enough to freeze him in place. Mr. Sterling, she barked. Blake flinched, his hand hovering over the paper. You will not touch that document, the judge ordered. But I did not know, Blake pleaded, looking desperate. He looked at me, his eyes wide and begging. Mackenzie, come on, this is crazy. 150 billion, we are partners. We are a team. You cannot just let me sign this away. Judge Caldwell pointed a finger at the signature at the bottom of the page. The ink was still fresh, dark and glossy against the white paper. You were in a hurry. Mr. Sterling, the judge said, her voice cold and final. You wanted to leave. You said you had no time. You said my client had nothing of value to offer you. You signed it, the judge said. You signed it freely. You signed it with the advice of counsel, and you signed it before you heard the contents of that envelope because you were too arrogant to listen. Blake looked at the signature. It was his name. He had written it with such pride only minutes ago. Now, it looked like a death warrant. He looked at me. The sneer was gone. The confidence was gone. All that was left was a man who had just realized he had sold a diamond for the price of a piece of glass. And he had done it while laughing at the gem. Mackenzie, please, he whispered. I stood up. I smoothed my skirt. I picked up my purse. I believe you have a meeting to get to. Blake, I said, you really should not be late. The new owner is very particular about punctuality. I turned and walked toward the door, leaving him standing in the cold, sterile room, staring at the piece of paper that had just cost him the world. The silence in the room fractured not with a whimper, but with a sudden, violent pivot in Blake's demeanor. The shock that had paralyzed him only moments ago dissolved, replaced instantly by the predatory instinct that had allowed him to climb the middle rungs of the corporate ladder. He did not beg this time. He did not look at the door. He looked at the money. "Hold on," Blake said, his voice dropping to a low, aggressive timbre. He planted his hands flat on the table, leaning in toward Judge Caldwell. "You cannot just dismiss this. We are in a community property state. I do not care what the papers say about a transfer 72 hours ago. That transfer happened while we were legally married. That makes it a marital asset." He turned to me, his eyes narrowing. The man who had looked at me with pity 10 minutes ago was now looking at me like a vulture eyeing a fresh kill. "You tried to hide it, Mackenzie. That is fraud. You think you can just walk away with $150 billion. I am entitled to 50% of that portfolio. I helped you. I supported us while you sat around waiting for your mother to die." The cruelty of his words hung in the air, heavy and toxic. I felt a sharp pang in my chest at the mention of my mother, but I pushed it down. This was not the time for grief. This was the time for justice. Alyssa did not even blink. She did not raise her voice. She simply reached into her briefcase again and pulled out a leather-bound folder. It was thinner than the inheritance documents, but far more lethal. "Actually, Mr. Sterling," Alyssa said, her tone as dry as dust. "That is incorrect," Blake scoffed, waving a hand at her. "Do not try to lawyer me. Alyssa, I know the statutes. Anything acquired during the marriage is split down the middle." Alyssa opened the folder and slid a single document across the table. It was yellowed slightly at the edges, the paper bearing the watermark of a notary public from 7 years ago. "I am sure you recognize this," Alyssa said. Blake looked down. He frowned. It was our prenuptial agreement. I watched the recognition dawn on him, followed immediately by confusion. "Yeah, I signed a prenup," Blake said, dismissing it, "to protect my assets, to protect my 401k and my signing bonus from Crestfall. Read Article 4, Section B," Alyssa instructed calmly. Blake snatched the paper up. His eyes scanned the legal jargon. I knew exactly what it said. I had memorized it the night I signed it, the night Blake had taken me to a noisy diner, laughed over a greasy burger, and told me that his lawyer insisted on it because he was a man of potential, and I was, well, just Mackenzie. He had handed me that pen 7 years ago with a grin, saying, "Do not worry, babe. It is just a formality, unless you're planning to hide a fortune from me." He had laughed at his own joke. He had thought it was hilarious because, in his mind, the idea of me having anything worth protecting was absurd. I watched him read the clause now. Any and all inheritance, bequests, or trust distributions received by either party during the course of the marriage shall remain the sole and separate property of the beneficiary, regardless of the timing of the acquisition. Both parties hereby waive any claim to the other's familial estate. Blake stopped reading. His lips moved silently as he reread the sentence. "You insisted on that clause." "Blake," I said quietly. He looked up at me, his face flushing a deep, angry red. I did not mean. You were so afraid that I would take your $30,000 in savings that you built a wall around my billions." I said, "You were so convinced that you were the only one with a future that you never stopped to ask where I came from." "No," Blake stammered, shaking his head. "This is unconscionable. I signed this under duress. I did not have full disclosure of assets." "You had full disclosure," Alyssa countered, tapping the document. "There is an appendix listing Evelyn Murphy as a high net worth individual. You just never asked how high. You saw her heavy knit sweaters and her old station wagon, and you assumed she was nobody." I remembered the times Blake had visited my mother's house. He had sneered at her antique furniture, calling it dusty junk. He had rolled his eyes when she served us tea in mismatched china. "Your mom is nice," he had told me once in the car ride home, "but she really needs to get with the times. She acts like she is poor." He had never realized that the junk was 17th century French cabinetry worth more than his entire college education. He had never realized that the mismatched china was from a limited Meissen collection. He saw what he wanted to see: a simple, unsophisticated woman he could feel superior to. He never asked her a single question about her life. I said, my voice trembling slightly with the suppressed anger of 7 years, "You sat at her dinner table and bragged about your entry-level management deals, and she just smiled and listened. She ran an empire, Blake, and you treated her like she was invisible." Judge Caldwell cleared her throat, bringing the focus back to the bench. "There is one more thing. Mr. Sterling," the judge said. Blake looked up, a flicker of desperate hope in his eyes. He was looking for a loophole, a lifeline. The judge held up a separate sheet of paper, a codicil attached to the will. Evelyn Murphy included a specific instruction regarding the governance of her estate in the event that her daughter was still married at the time of the transfer. Blake straightened up. I could see the gears turning in his head. He thought this was it. He thought my mother, the nice old lady, had left something for him, maybe a stipend, maybe a seat at the table. He straightened his tie, his arrogance attempting to reassemble itself. "What does it say?" Blake asked, his voice regaining some of its smooth confidence. "Did she leave instructions for spousal involvement, I mean? I am a senior director at her company. It would make sense for her to want my expertise utilized." The judge looked at him over her glasses. Her expression was unreadable. "Not exactly," Judge Caldwell said. She began to read. "To my son-in-law, Blake Sterling, if you are still married to my daughter when you read this, it means she has not yet found the strength to leave you. Therefore, I offer this not as a gift, but as a final lesson in due diligence." Blake's smile faltered. "You have spent 7 years working for my company," the judge read. "You have spent 7 years trying to impress strangers while ignoring the partner in your own home. You claim to be a leader. You claim to understand value. Yet you have failed to recognize the most valuable asset in your life." The judge paused. "There is no bequest for you, Mr. Sterling. There is only a mirror." Blake stared at the judge, his face slack. "That is it, a lecture from the grave." I stood up slowly. The time for silence was over. "It is not just a lecture, Blake," I said. "It is a reference to your performance reviews." He spun around to face me. "My performance reviews? What are you talking about? I have stellar reviews. I am on the fast track to vice president. Are you?" I asked. I walked around the table until I was standing only a few feet from him. I needed him to see my eyes. I needed him to see that the woman he had dismissed as a passenger had been driving the bus the entire time. "Do you remember the emails you sent last month to the Oversight Committee?" I asked. "The ones regarding the board composition?" Blake frowned. "I sent hundreds of emails. You sent a series of emails to the anonymous governance address." I clarified. "You complained about the dead weight on the board. You specifically targeted a member you called a legacy hire. You said this person was out of touch, contributed nothing to the meetings, and was holding the company back with outdated caution." Blake's face went pale. He remembered. I could see it in his eyes. He had been so proud of those emails. He had read them to me over dinner, laughing about how he was going to shake up the dinosaurs at corporate. "You demanded the immediate removal of a board member listed in the minutes as M. Murphy," I said. Blake froze. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He had assumed M. Murphy was some distant cousin, some elderly nephew of the founder who was just collecting a check. He had built his entire case for promotion on the idea that he could cut costs by trimming the fat at the top. Alyssa reached into her file and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a printout of an email, time-stamped 3 weeks ago. She handed it to Blake. He took it with a trembling hand. He looked at the text. "Subject urgent restructuring proposal to Governance Committee from Blake Sterling." Body. "It is my professional opinion that board member M. Murphy lacks the strategic vision required for Crestfall's future. Their questions during the quarterly review were pedestrian and showed a lack of understanding of modern aggressive real estate tactics. We need to cut this dead weight." I leaned in close to him. "You called me a dinosaur." "Blake, you called my questions pedestrian." He looked up from the paper, his eyes wide with horror. "That was you," he whispered. I nodded. The questions I asked in those meetings were about risk management. I said, they were about protecting the pension fund. They were about ethical sourcing. Things you called boring when you came home and complained about the mystery board member who kept blocking your reckless deals. I tapped the paper in his hand. You tried to fire me from my own company. Blake, you tried to fire the woman who owns the chair you sit in. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't just losing his wife. He wasn't just losing the money. He had spent the last month actively insulting his boss, on the record, in writing. While she sat across the dinner table and poured his wine, Judge Caldwell closed the file on her desk with a final, heavy thud. "I think we are done here," the judge said. "The divorce decree is signed. The assets are separate, and Mr. Sterling." She looked at him with a mixture of pity and disdain. "I suggest you check your email. I believe the new chairwoman has a very strict policy regarding insubordination. I did not go out for champagne. I did not call my friends to celebrate my newfound freedom. There is a specific kind of hollowness that follows the end of a marriage, even a bad one, and I had no desire to fill it with noise. Instead, I got into the back of the black sedan waiting at the curb and gave the driver a single instruction. To the tower. I said, the Murphy Dominion Tower stood in the center of the financial district, a monolith of glass and steel that pierced the skyline. For 7 years, Blake had walked through the revolving doors of the lobby, swiped his badge, and taken the elevator to the 14th floor. He called it the trenches. He loved the noise, the chaos, the aggressive energy of the sales floor where Crestfall Realty operated. He had never been to the 42nd floor. The elevator to the executive suite required a retinal scan. When the doors slid open, the air changed. It was quieter up here. The carpet was thicker. The light was softer. This was where the decisions were made that determined whether the people on the 14th floor got bonuses or pink slips. I walked down the hallway, the heels of my shoes sinking silently into the wool runner. The staff here, the senior analysts, the corporate counsel, the strategic planners stood up as I passed. They did not know me as Blake Sterling's wife. To them, I had always been the proxy for Evelyn Murphy, the quiet force behind the directives. Now, I was simply the boss. I entered the boardroom. It was a cavernous space with a view that stretched all the way to the harbor. Waiting for me were the head of legal, a sharp-eyed man named Marcus, and the director of internal audit, a woman named Sarah, who could find a missing penny in a budget of $10 billion. They looked at me with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. They knew about the divorce. In a company this size, information traveled faster than light. "Good afternoon," I said, placing my bag on the head of the table. "Good afternoon, Ms. Murphy," Marcus replied. I sat down. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I want a full review of the promotion protocols within Crestfall Realty over the last 7 years. I stated. Sarah opened her laptop, her fingers hovering over the keys. "Are we looking for a specific violation, Ms. Murphy? Or is this a general compliance audit?" I looked at the screen on the wall, which displayed the live feed of the company organizational chart. "We are looking for systemic failure." I said, "I want to know how performance metrics are verified. I want to know if there is a correlation between social proximity to management and career advancement. And I want a forensic audit of every deal closed by the senior director tier in the Northeast Division." Sarah typed quickly. "That includes Mr. Sterling's division, especially Mr. Sterling's division." I confirmed, "But this is not a witch hunt. Sarah, do not target him explicitly yet. If he is incompetent or unethical, the data will show it. I want the system to catch him, not a decree from this office. We do nothing that looks like personal retribution. Is that clear, Crystal?" Marcus said. While they worked, I pulled up the security feed from the lobby on my tablet. It was a habit my mother had taught me. You learn more watching people enter the building than you do reading their resumes, she used to say. I saw Blake walk in. He looked like a man who had been punched in the gut. His tie was slightly askew. He was walking slower than usual, lacking that bounce in his step that bordered on arrogance. He stopped at the security turnstile, fumbling for his badge. For a second, he looked up at the ceiling, as if he could feel the weight of the building pressing down on him. He had no idea I was 40 floors above him, watching him on a high-definition screen. As he passed through the gates, a group of junior brokers from his team intercepted him. I adjusted the audio feed to listen in. Sterling, one of them, shouted, clapping him on the back. I heard the news. Man, you are finally free. Blake flinched. The word free clearly tasted like ash in his mouth. Yeah. Another guy laughed. No more rushing home for meatloaf. Right tonight. Drinks are on us. You dodged a bullet. Blake, imagine being stuck with the same woman for another decade. I watched Blake's face. He tried to smile, but it looked more like a grimace of pain. He knew exactly what he had dodged. He had dodged a seat at the table of a dynasty. He had dodged generational wealth. He had dodged the only person who had ever truly loved him, and he had done it for the applause of men who would steal his clients the moment he faltered. I have work to do, Blake muttered, pushing past them. I closed the feed. Marcus, I said, turning back to the room, send out a calendar invite. Mandatory all-hands meeting for Crestfall staff. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Who should we list as the host, Marcus asked. The office of the chairwoman. I said, do not use my name. Let them wonder. Fear is a better motivator than curiosity. I turned to Sarah. One more thing. Reactivate the anonymous ethics hotline. Sarah looked up, surprised. It has been dormant for 2 years. The previous management at Crestfall discouraged it. They said it lowered morale. They discouraged it because they were hiding things. I said, reactivate it and update the policy. Any employee who reports a verified ethics violation regarding intellectual property theft or credit misappropriation gets a protection guarantee and a bonus equal to 5% of the project's value. Sarah's eyebrows shot up. 5%. That will start a war. Ms. Murphy, everyone will be looking for dirt on their bosses. Good, I said coldly. If the management is clean, they have nothing to fear. If they built their careers on the backs of their subordinates, I want to know about it before the market opens on Monday. The afternoon wore on. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the mahogany table. I spent the hours poring over the project files that Sarah had pulled from the archives. I was looking for patterns. My mother had always said that Blake was a magpie. He liked shiny things, but he did not know how to build a nest. He stole scraps from others. I opened the file for the Hudson Yards expansion. It was the project that had earned Blake his director title 3 years ago. It was a brilliant piece of negotiation, securing air rights that everyone said were impossible to get. I remembered that year. Blake had been stressed, angry, constantly complaining that he was stuck. Then, suddenly, he had come home one night beaming, claiming he had had a breakthrough in the shower. I flipped through the digital records. The final proposal was polished, aggressive, and smart. It had Blake's digital signature all over it. But then I opened the metadata history. My mother had insisted on a proprietary logging system that tracked every keystroke on the company server. Most employees did not know it existed. I traced the origin of the breakthrough idea. It had not originated from Blake's terminal. The core strategy document had been created 2 weeks before Blake pitched it. It had been created by a junior analyst named David Chen Numbo. Wait, not Chen. I squinted at the screen. The name was David Klein. I opened the original draft from Klein's folder. It was identical to Blake's final pitch, paragraph for paragraph. Then I saw it. At the bottom of the original document, there was a digital note, a time-stamped approval request sent to Blake. Blake, here is the strategy for the air rights. I think this loophole in the zoning law is our ticket. Let me know what you think. And below that, a reply from Blake. This is garbage. David, it is too risky. Scrap it. I will handle the strategy myself. 3 days later, Blake had submitted the exact same document to the board under his own name, claiming sole authorship. I felt a cold rage settle in my stomach. It was not just that he was a liar, it was that he was a thief who destroyed the confidence of talented people to feed his own ego. I continued scrolling. I found another file, the the riverfront redevelopment, another one of Blake's big wins. I opened the due diligence report. Everything looked standard until I reached the environmental impact survey. The summary page stated that the land was clean and ready for residential zoning. But something about the font looked wrong. The spacing was slightly off, as if a line had been deleted. I clicked on the version history. There was a previous version, saved 48 hours before the final submission. I opened it. The summary in the original version did not say clean. It said, moderate soil contamination detected, remediation required before zoning approval. My heart stopped. If Blake had erased a contamination warning to push a deal through, that was not just plagiarism, that was fraud. That was criminal. I looked closer at the signature page on the altered document. It was signed by the independent inspector, but when I zoomed in on the signature, the pixelation was jagged. It was a copy-paste job. I picked up the phone and dialed Marcus. "Do not go home yet," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is everything all right, Ms. Murphy?" he asked. "No," I said, staring at the fraudulent signature on the screen. "I think I just found the smoking gun, and the fingerprints on it are fresh." I stayed in the boardroom as evening settled over the city, the glass walls turning the skyline into a glittering grid of electric light. From my vantage point, the world looked orderly, controlled by currents of money and influence. But down below, on the 14th floor, Blake's world was unraveling with messy, human unpredictability. I had access to the company's internal communication logs, but I did not need technology to know what Blake was doing. I knew him. When Blake felt cornered, he did not reflect. He reached out for validation. He needed someone to tell him he was still the golden boy, the winner, the man who defied the odds. He would call Tessa. Tessa Monroe was a leasing agent for a rival firm, a woman who treated relationships like networking events. She was beautiful, sharp, and entirely transactional. Blake thought she was in love with his charisma. I knew she was in love with his access to the Murphy Dominion portfolio. I could not hear their call, but I could see the metadata on his company phone log. He had dialed her number 3 times in 10 minutes. Finally, a connection. I imagined the conversation. He would be spinning the divorce as a victory. "I am free, babe. No more baggage. Just you and me and the open road." But Tessa was plugged into the rumor mill by now. The invitation for the mandatory all-hands meeting, hosted by the office of the chairwoman, had circulated through the industry grapevine. People were talking. They knew a shakeup was coming. They knew the new owner was bloodthirsty. Later, I would learn from a mutual acquaintance exactly how that call went. Blake had tried to brag about the settlement, leaving out the part where he walked away with nothing but his 401k. "So, you are out?" Tessa had asked, her voice cutting through his fantasy. "You signed the papers done and dusted." Blake had replied, "I am a free agent, and your position at Crestfall," she pressed. "I heard rumors." "Blake, I heard the new ownership is freezing all senior management promotions. I heard they are auditing the Hudson Yards deal." "That is just noise." Blake had lied, though his voice likely wavered. "I am untouchable. I am the top earner in the division." "But do you have equity?" Tessa asked. "Do you have a seat on the board? Or are you just an employee?" "Blake, because if you are just an employee under investigation, that is a very different look. I'm going to run this place one day." Blake insisted. "Call me when you do," Tessa said. "Until then, I think we should cool it. I cannot be associated with a compliance risk. It is bad for my brand." She hung up. I watched on the security feed as Blake threw his phone against the passenger seat of his car in the parking garage. He sat there for a long time, his head resting on the steering wheel. The silence of the car must have been deafening. He had lost the wife he took for granted, and within hours, he had lost the mistress who only wanted him for the status he no longer possessed. He was alone, and for a man like Blake, solitude was terrifying. A few minutes later, my own phone buzzed on the mahogany table. I looked at the screen. Blake. He was cycling through his options. Plan A. The mistress had failed. Now he was attempting Plan B, the emotional manipulation of the ex-wife. I picked up the phone but did not answer. I let it go to voicemail. Then, a text message appeared. Mac, I am sitting here thinking about that trip we took to Cabo, the way the sunset looked on the water. We were good then, weren't we? I know today was rough. I know I said some things I did not mean. The stress of the job gets to me. Maybe we can grab coffee. Just to talk. No lawyers, just us. I read the words with a detachment that surprised me. 7 years ago. This text would have made me cry. It would have made me question if I was being too hard on him. I would have made excuses for his cruelty, blaming his stress, blaming his ambition. But now, I saw it for what it was, a probe. He was testing the perimeter, seeing if there was a crack in the wall he could slip through. He wanted to know if I was still the Mackenzie who would fix his mistakes. I typed a reply, my fingers moving steadily. You signed the papers. I hit send. Then I blocked his number. On the screen in front of me, I watched Blake enter the building again. He looked haggard. He walked onto the sales floor, his eyes darting around. The atmosphere in the office had shifted. It was subtle, but palpable. Usually, when Blake walked in, junior associates would perk up, hoping for a nod or a smile. Today, heads stayed down. People were typing furiously, glued to their screens. They were avoiding eye contact. Blake walked past the office of the regional VP, a man named Henderson who used to go golfing with Blake every Sunday. Hey, Jim Blake called out, forcing a smile. Got a minute to talk about the quarterly targets? Henderson did not even look up from his desk. He waved a hand dismissively. Cannot right now. Blake, preparing for the big meeting tomorrow. Door is closed. Henderson got up and physically closed his glass door. Blake stood there, stranded in the middle of the hallway. He looked like a ghost that did not realize it had died. The fear of the audit was spreading like a virus. No one knew who the new chairwoman was, but they knew she was watching, and no one wanted to be seen standing next to the man who was rumored to be the target. Blake retreated to his office. He closed the blinds. On my monitor, a red alert flag popped up. User B, Sterling. Action file deletion. Batch quantity 45 files. My breath hitched. He was panicking. He was trying to scrub his hard drive. I picked up the intercom to the IT department. Do not stop him. I ordered the technician on the other end. Let him delete whatever he wants. Just make sure the shadow backup is capturing every single keystroke. Spoliation of evidence is a much harder charge to beat than incompetence. I watched the file names scroll by on my secondary screen as he deleted them. Hudson Yards Draft V2. Riverfront Enviro Report. Emails Tessa. He thought he was cleaning the crime scene. In reality, he was leaving a trail of digital footprints that led straight to the gallows. I turned my attention back to the stack of physical files Sarah had left for me. I was comparing Blake's strategic memos from the last 3 years against the private notebooks my mother and I had kept during our Tuesday board meetings. The similarities were chilling. I found a memo from Blake dated 2 years ago. Subject, The Future of Urban Warehousing. In it, he proposed shifting the company's focus from luxury condos to last-mile logistics centers in the outer boroughs. It was the move that had saved his division's profitability that year. I opened my notebook from the month prior to that memo. In my handwriting, I had written, Crestfall is overexposed in luxury residential. We need to pivot. Logistics is the bottleneck. Suggest acquisition of warehouses in Queens and the Bronx. I remembered that week. I had discussed this idea on the phone with my mother while I was cooking dinner. Blake had been in the living room, watching football, or so I thought. He had been listening. He had listened to my analysis, waited 2 weeks, and then pitched it as his own original epiphany. I flipped to another page. My note, the interest rates are going to spike. We need to lock in fixed-rate debt on the commercial portfolio immediately. Blake's memo. 10 days later. Market analysis suggests a rate hike. I recommend immediate refinancing to fixed rates. He had not just stolen from his subordinates, he had stolen from his wife. He had treated our home not as a sanctuary, but as a corporate espionage site. He had mined my intellect to build his reputation, all while telling me to my face that I did not understand business. The betrayal felt different than the infidelity. The infidelity was a weakness of the flesh. This was a violation of the mind. It was a calculated, parasitic extraction of my value. I felt a knock on the open doorframe. Sarah, the auditor, stood there. Her face was pale. She was holding a tablet. "Ms. Murphy," she said, her voice tight. "The ethics hotline has been active for 40 minutes. I looked up, rubbing my temples. "Do we have traffic?" Sarah nodded grimly. "The server is almost crashing. It seems people have been waiting a long time for a safe place to speak." She walked over and placed the tablet in front of me. "Most of them are minor grievances," Sarah said. "Overtime disputes, expense account padding, but this one just came in 2 minutes ago. It was flagged as high priority because of the attached evidence." I looked at the screen. Report ID 88392. Sender anonymous. Verified employee ID. Subject intellectual property theft. Hostile work environment. Message: "I do not know who is reading this, but I cannot stay quiet anymore. The Senior Director of the Northeast Division, Blake Sterling, has systematically claimed credit for the work of his entire analyst team for 5 years. He threatens to blacklist us if we speak up. I have attached the original metadata for the Skyline project. He did not write it. I did. And he told me if I ever claimed it, he would make sure I never worked in this city again." I looked up at Sarah. "Who sent this?" I asked. Sarah tapped the screen to reveal the encrypted ID. "It is not an analyst," Sarah said. "It is his current associate director, the man Blake calls his right hand." I stared at the name. The betrayal had come full circle. Blake had built a house of cards on the backs of people he thought were loyal, but loyalty bought with fear has an expiration date, and it seemed that date was today. "Print it," I said, my voice cold. "Print everything." The temptation to simply decapitate Blake's career with a single executive order was overwhelming, but I knew that would be a mistake. If I fired him tomorrow, he would run to the press. He would paint himself as the victim of a vindictive ex-wife who used her inheritance to crush a hard-working man. He would sue for wrongful termination. And even if we won, the headline would be about my pettiness, not his incompetence. I needed him to be the architect of his own destruction. "Sarah," I said, turning away from the window where I had been watching the city lights, "expand the scope of the audit." Sarah looked up from her laptop, surprised. "Expand it, Ms. Murphy. We have enough on Sterling to terminate him for cause right now. The plagiarism alone is—" "No," I interrupted. "If we target only him, it looks personal. I want a full compliance review of the entire senior director tier across all 4 regional divisions. I want every expense report, every client interaction log, and every project attribution verified for the last 36 months. But that will take weeks," Sarah protested. "You have 48 hours, I said. "Put the entire external team on it. I want Blake to feel like he is just one of many under the microscope. I want him to believe this is a systemic purge, not a targeted strike. That way, when the hammer falls, he cannot claim he was singled out. He will just be a casualty of excellence." Sarah nodded slowly. "Understanding the play. Understood. I will frame it as a pre-acquisition due diligence sweep. That usually scares everyone into honesty." As Sarah typed out the orders, Marcus from Legal slid a thick binder across the table. "This just came up from Human Resources," Marcus said. "It seems the reactivation of the ethics hotline has emboldened the HR department to release some pensioned files. These are complaints against Mr. Sterling that were previously suppressed by his former boss." I opened the binder. It was a catalog of petty theft, but not of money. Blake stole credit. There was a report from a junior graphic designer. She claimed that Blake had asked her to prepare a slide deck for the Midtown revitalization pitch. She had spent 3 weekends working on it, creating custom infographics and financial models. On the day of the presentation, Blake had asked for the source file, just to make a few tweaks. He had changed the title font. He had removed her name from the credits, and then he had stood in front of the committee, my committee, and presented it as his solo vision. "He is a curator," I murmured, reading the report. "He does not create anything. He just collects other people's work and puts his frame around it. But the next realization was far more personal, and it made my skin crawl. I began cross-referencing the dates of Blake's breakthrough ideas with my own calendar. I looked at a project he had launched 2 years ago called the Micro-Unit Residential Strategy. It had been a massive success for the firm. I checked my private journals from that year, 3 days before Blake pitched that idea. I had brought it up during an anonymous board feedback session. I had dictated a memo to the then CEO about the shifting demographics of young professionals requiring smaller, more affordable living spaces. Blake had not just stolen from his staff, he had stolen from the board. He had taken the directives that I had issued as M. Murphy, repackaged them, and sold them back to the company as his own genius. He was selling me my own ideas, I whispered, feeling a wave of nausea. Every time I complimented him on his strategic alignment, I was just complimenting my own echo, Alyssa, who had been silently reviewing the prenuptial addendums in the corner, looked up. She saw the look on my face, the mix of rage and humiliation. Mackenzie, Alyssa said sharply. I looked at her. Do not do it, she warned. I can see you wanting to go down there and scream at him. I can see you wanting to tell him that he is a fraud to his face. He used me. Alyssa, I said, my voice shaking. He used the board minutes. He must have seen them on my laptop when I left the room. And that is valuable evidence, Alyssa said, her voice calm and steady. But if you act on emotion now, you lose the high ground. This is a siege, not a duel. Let the system chew him up. If you intervene, he becomes a martyr. If the system catches him, he is just a failure. I took a deep breath. She was right. The revenge had to be cold. It had to be administrative. An hour later, the notifications went out. Every senior director received a generic email inviting them to a compliance and standards interview as part of the new ownership transition. It was vague, bureaucratic, and terrifying. I watched Blake on the security feed when he got the email. He was in his office, pacing. He read the screen, then walked to the door and looked out at his team. He was looking for enemies. He called his administrative assistant in. I could not hear the audio, but I saw his body language. He was aggressive, pointing at the computer, demanding to know if she had spoken to anyone from corporate. She shook her head, looking terrified. He dismissed her with a wave of his hand. He is paranoid, Marcus observed. Watching the screen with me, he thinks someone snitched. He does not realize the call is coming from inside the house. Then, the twist arrived. Sarah's computer chimed with a priority alert. We have a verified identity on the anonymous whistleblower from earlier. Sarah said, the one who sent the Skyline Project metadata. I walked over to her station. Who is it? I expected it to be a rival. Someone Blake had stepped on. It is Jason Miller, Sarah said. I stared at the name. Jason Miller was Blake's associate director. He was the young man Blake had handpicked from the internship program 5 years ago. Blake had mentored him. Blake had taken him to baseball games. Blake referred to him as my guy. He is turning on him, I asked. Sarah opened the attachment Jason had sent. He is terrified. Sarah explained. Look at his cover note. To the office of the chairwoman, please do not fire me. I know what the audit is going to find. I know the numbers on the Hudson deal were cooked. I wanted to report it back then. But Mr. Sterling told me that loyalty is the only currency that matters. I have a family. I just did what I was told. Here are the original emails where he instructed me to alter the occupancy projections. Blake had built his safety net out of people he thought he owned, but he forgot that people who are taught to cheat for you will eventually cheat on you to save themselves. Jason Miller wasn't a traitor. He was just a student who had learned his lesson too well. I looked at the document Jason had attached. It was an audio file. What is this? I asked. It was recorded 6 months ago. Sarah said, it looks like an accidental recording from a conference room system. They left the microphone on after a video call ended. I clicked play. The sound of chairs scraping against the floor filled the room. Then, Blake's voice, loud and booming, clearly holding court with his subordinates. Do not worry about the board, Blake was saying. They are toothless, especially that Murphy character. I froze. My hand hovered over the pause button, but I let it play. Who even is M? Murphy. Another voice asked. It sounded like Jason. Is it the old lady? No? Blake scoffed. It is probably some trust fund baby. Some nephew or niece who sits around eating gold flakes and pretending to understand real estate. I bet they have never set foot on a construction site in their life. We just have to feed them pretty reports, and they will sign whatever we put in front of them. They are irrelevant. The room on the recording laughed. Blake laughed the loudest. I stared at the speaker. The date of the recording was May 12th. I remembered May 12th. I checked my calendar to be sure. On May 12th, I had been in the building. In fact, I had been in that very conference room. I had been sitting in the adjacent observation booth, separated by one-way glass, auditing the video conferencing equipment for an upgrade. I had been sitting 3 feet away from him, separated by a pane of glass and a layer of arrogance so thick it was impenetrable. I had heard him laugh. I had thought he was laughing at a joke. I did not know he was laughing at me. I looked up at Alyssa. My face was dry. I was past the point of tears. He called me irrelevant. I said softly. Alyssa did not say anything. She just watched me. I picked up the phone and dialed Marcus. Is the interview room ready? I asked. Yes, Ms. Murphy, Marcus replied. Bring him in, I said, and make sure the air conditioning is set to freezing. The auditorium on the ground floor of the Crestfall Realty headquarters was a cavernous space designed to make human beings feel small. It was usually reserved for shareholder meetings or celebratory galas where executives patted themselves on the back for record-breaking quarters. Today, however, the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of energy. It was the heavy, suffocating static of collective anxiety. I stood in the wings of the stage, watching the feed on a small monitor. The room was packed to capacity. 700 employees sat shoulder to shoulder, their hushed whispers merging into a low, nervous drone that sounded like a hive of disturbed bees. They knew something monumental had shifted. Rumors of the compliance sweep had spread through the building like wildfire during the night. They knew the old leadership was gone. They knew the new owner was in the building, but they had no idea who she was. I scanned the crowd on the screen, looking for one face in particular. I found him. Blake was not in the front row, where he usually sat during these assemblies, legs crossed, laughing loudly at the CEO's jokes to ensure he was noticed. Today, Blake Sterling was sitting in the very last row, squeezed between a pillar and a junior accountant from the payroll department. He wore sunglasses, which he had foolishly pushed up onto his head, forgetting that the glare of the overhead lights made him look pale and sweaty. He kept checking his phone, likely waiting for a reply from Tessa that would never come. He looked like a man trying to disappear. It is time, Ms. Murphy, the stage manager whispered, tapping his headset. I nodded. I smoothed the front of my suit. It was a simple, charcoal-tailored piece, no jewelry, no scarf, no distractions. For years, Blake had told me to dress in pastels, to wear soft fabrics that made me look approachable and harmless. You want to look like a supportive wife. Mac, he would say, not a competitor. Today, I dressed like the person who signed his paychecks. The house lights dimmed, plunging the audience into darkness. A single spotlight cut through the gloom, illuminating the center of the stage. The murmuring died down instantly. The silence that followed was absolute. I walked out. The sound of my heels clicking against the hardwood floor echoed through the speakers. I did not rush. I walked to the podium with the measured pace of someone who owned not just the stage, but the land it was built on. I placed my hands on the lectern and looked out into the darkness, blindingly bright in the spotlight. But I knew they could see me. For a moment, I said nothing. I let the image of me Mackenzie, the woman they might have seen at the company holiday party holding Blake's coat, sink in. Good morning, I said. My voice was amplified, clear and steady. Reaching every corner of the room, I heard a ripple of confusion move through the front rows. A few people squinted. Someone whispered, "Is that Blake's wife?" My name is Mackenzie Murphy. I continued, ignoring the whispers, and effective 72 hours ago. I am the chairwoman and majority shareholder of Murphy Dominion Holdings. The gasp was audible. It started in the front and rolled backward like a wave. Murphy Dominion, the parent company, the entity that controlled everything. I saw heads turn toward the back of the room, looking for Blake. They were connecting the dots. Murphy Dominion, Mackenzie Murphy. The realization was hitting them in real time. I continued, my voice hardening slightly. For a long time, the leadership of this company has operated under the assumption that the ownership was distant, disengaged, and uninterested in the day-to-day operations of Crestfall Realty. You believed that as long as the profit margins remained green, no one was watching how those margins were achieved. I paused. You were wrong. I leaned into the microphone. My mother, Evelyn Murphy, founded this conglomerate. She was a woman who believed that true power is quiet. She believed that a leader does not need to force people to kneel to prove they are standing tall. She believed that integrity is an asset class, just like real estate. I looked directly toward the back of the room, though I could not see Blake through the glare of the lights. I knew he was there. I knew he was shrinking into his seat, his heart hammering against his ribs. However, in recent years, a different culture has taken root at Crestfall. I said, a culture of ego, a culture where the loudest voice in the room is mistaken for the smartest, a culture where credit is a currency that is stolen from the hardworking and hoarded by the ambitious. I picked up the remote for the presentation screen behind me. A giant timeline appeared. It spanned the last 7 years. This ends today. I announced, effective immediately. I have ordered a forensic review of every promotion, every bonus allocation, and every project attribution that has occurred within this firm over the last 7 years. The room went deadly quiet. 7 years. That was the exact timeline of Blake's career. It was the exact duration of our marriage. To the average employee, it sounded like a standard audit period. To Blake, it was a sniper scope aimed directly at his chest. We are not looking for mistakes, I clarified. We all make mistakes. We are looking for theft. I stepped out from behind the podium, walking to the edge of the stage. The spotlight followed me. I have read the personnel files. I have seen the exit interviews of brilliant analysts who left this company because they were told they had no future here, only to see their ideas implemented by their managers 6 months later. I want those managers to know something. I lowered my voice, making it intimate, dangerous. I was in the room when those ideas were presented to the board. I took notes. I know who the real authors are, and I know who the mimics are. I could feel the tension in the room snapping. Beside Blake, people were shifting away from him, creating a physical gap. They did not need me to say his name. His guilt was radiating off him like heat. He had spent years bragging about his solo wins, about his genius intuition. Now, everyone in that hall realized that his genius was nothing more than a photocopy machine. If you are a creator in this room, I said, addressing the hundreds of junior staff members, your time has come. You will be recognized, you will be compensated, and you will be protected. I paused, letting the promise land. But if you are a parasite, if you built your career on the foundation of someone else's labor, I suggest you visit the Human Resources Department before they visit you, because the window for amnesty is closing. I looked at the crowd one last time. Crestfall is no longer a kingdom for the loud. I stated, it is a meritocracy, and the rent is due. Thank you. I turned and walked off the stage. The applause did not start immediately. The audience was too stunned. Then, slowly, it began. It started from the back, from the analysts, the assistants, the people who had been stepped on. It grew louder, a wave of relief and vindication, but I did not stop to acknowledge it. I walked straight to the wings, where the shadows welcomed me back. As the house lights came up, signaling the end of the assembly, I moved to a vantage point near the exit doors. I wanted to see the exodus. I wanted to see the faces of the people who now knew that the game had changed. The doors swung open, and the crowd spilled out, talking excitedly, their voices a mix of shock and adrenaline. And then I saw him. Blake was one of the last to leave. He looked like a man who had survived a bombing but lost his hearing. His face was gray. He was walking mechanically, his eyes fixed on the floor. He was alone. The crowd parted around him, flowing like water around a stone that had suddenly become toxic. He reached the threshold of the door. He paused, perhaps sensing a presence. He looked up. I was standing 10 feet away, flanked by 2 security guards. I was not smiling. I was not gloating. I simply looked at him. Our eyes locked. It lasted only 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, I saw the complete collapse of his reality. He looked at me, and he did not see his wife. He did not see the woman who fetched his dry cleaning. He saw the chairwoman. He saw the person who had read his emails, heard his insults, and tracked his thefts. He opened his mouth slightly, as if to speak, to say my name, to beg, to explain. I did not blink. I did not nod. I just stared at him with the cold, impartial judgment of a goddess weighing a soul against a feather. Then, I turned my back on him and walked away. The silence that followed the town hall meeting lasted exactly 48 hours. I had expected Blake to retreat, to lick his wounds, and perhaps, for the first time in his life, reflect on the gravity of his mistakes. I should have known better. A narcissist does not reflect. He reloads. On Thursday morning, the ceasefire ended not with a phone call, but with a courier dropping a heavy stack of documents onto the reception desk of the executive suite. Alyssa walked into my office, her face unreadable, holding the file. "He hired Stanton and Associates," Alyssa said, tossing the paperwork onto my desk. "They are a boutique firm known for high-conflict divorce litigation. They are nasty, expensive, and loud." I looked at the cover page. Sterling v. Murphy. Complaint for damages. Constructive termination. Fraudulent inducement. "He is suing me," I asked, flipping through the pages. "For what? I have not even fired him yet." He claims the audit is a targeted harassment campaign designed to force his resignation. Alyssa explained, sitting down and crossing her legs. "He claims you intentionally concealed your financial status during the marriage to entrap him in a disadvantageous prenuptial agreement. He is spinning a narrative, Mackenzie. He is saying you committed matrimonial fraud by pretending to be a housewife while secretly being a corporate overlord." I laughed. A dry, humorless sound. "He is arguing that my modesty was a weapon," I asked. "He is arguing that he would not have signed the prenup if he knew you were worth $150 billion, Alyssa corrected. "He is saying you tricked him into signing away his rights to a fortune he helped in his delusional mind to protect." I stood up and walked to the window. The audacity was breathtaking. "He called me a passenger," I whispered. "Now he wants to be the co-pilot." "It gets worse," Alyssa said. She pulled out a tablet. "He is not just fighting in court. He is fighting in the court of public opinion. He knows he cannot win on the law. So he is trying to burn the house down." She showed me a draft of an article from a popular real estate industry blog. The headline read, "The Widow's Trap: How the New Chairwoman of Murphy Dominion Deceived Her Husband for 7 years." "He is leaking this," I asked, feeling a spike of anger. "He is framing himself as the victim of a power-hungry heiress." Alyssa said, "The narrative is simple. You hid your identity, you spied on him, and now you are using your inheritance to emasculate the husband who supported you when you were nobody. It is a classic underdog story, and the press loves it." I felt a tightness in my chest. I had wanted to keep this professional. I had wanted to keep the company stable. But Blake was willing to drag the Murphy name through the mud if it meant he could squeeze a settlement out of me. "Let him publish it," I said coldly. "The moment he talks to the press about internal company matters, he violates his non-disclosure agreement. We can sue him for breach of contract. He is counting on that." Alyssa warned. "He wants a public fight. He thinks you will pay him $50 million just to make him go away." As we were strategizing, Sarah, the head of the audit team, burst into the room. She did not knock. Her face was flushed, and she was holding a printout that was still warm. "Ms. Murphy, you need to see this," Sarah said. Breathless, I turned around. "Is it more plagiarism?" "No," Sarah said. "It is worse, and it is better." She laid the paper on the desk. It was an email chain, but it wasn't from the company archives. It had been flagged by the security filter on Blake's corporate email account just 10 minutes ago. It was from Tessa Monroe. I leaned in to read. Subject Settlement Agreement, NDA Draft. From Tessa Monroe. To Blake Sterling. Blake, I saw the news about the lawsuit. I am not going to get dragged into your mess. If your wife's lawyers depose me, I will have to tell the truth about the last 3 years. Unless, of course, we have an understanding. My lawyer has drafted a confidentiality agreement. I want $200,000 in cash, and I will forget we ever met. If not, I have 3 years of text messages that prove you were spending company money on our business trips to Miami. You have 24 hours. I stared at the screen. Tessa had panicked. She thought Blake still had money, or access to it. In her attempt to extort him, she had just handed us the silver bullet. He was using company funds for the affair, I asked, looking at Sarah. Sarah nodded. I cross-referenced the dates in her email with his expense reports. The client development trip to Miami last February. There were no clients, just a suite at the Mandarin Oriental and a dinner for 2 that cost $4,000, charged to the Crestfall corporate card. I looked at Alyssa. That is embezzlement, Alyssa said, a small, dangerous smile playing on her lips. It is not a lot of money in the grand scheme, but it is theft. And it proves the affair. If he proceeds with this devoted husband narrative in the press, we release this. We show the world he was stealing from the wife he claims to have supported, to pay for the mistress he claimed was a client. I felt a surge of grim satisfaction. The crushed man narrative would crumble the moment the public saw he was funding his infidelity with my mother's money. But Sarah was not done. There is something else. Mackenzie, Sarah said, her voice dropping lower. The embezzlement is petty. What I found in the Riverfront file that is a felony. I stiffened. The Riverfront project, the one where he had erased the environmental warning. I dug deeper into the valuation models. Sarah explained. Blake was desperate to close that deal to get his director promotion. The bank required a 70% pre-lease commitment to release the construction loan. I nodded. That is standard. Blake only had 40%. Sarah said. So how did he get the loan, I asked. He forged the other 30%. Sarah said. She placed a stack of lease agreements on the table. These tenants, they do not exist. Apex Logistics, Vanguard Imports, I ran their tax IDs. They are shell companies registered to a P.O. box in Delaware, a P.O. box that was paid for by Blake's personal credit card. The room went silent. He created fake tenants to defraud the bank. I whispered. He committed bank fraud, wire fraud, and falsified corporate records. Sarah confirmed. The loan was for $300 million. If the bank finds out, they will call the loan immediately. It could bankrupt the division, and Blake is looking at 15 to 20 years in federal prison. I sat down heavily in my chair. This was no longer a divorce. This was a crime scene. I had the power to end him, completely. I could pick up the phone, call the FBI, and hand them the file. Blake would be arrested before dinner. He would be destroyed. His reputation, his freedom, his life gone. But my mother's voice echoed in my head. Power reveals character. Mackenzie, do not use the hammer just because you can lift it. If I sent him to prison, I was protecting the company, but if I did it right now, while he was suing me, it would look like retaliation. It would look like I dug up dirt to bury my ex-husband. Alyssa, I said, what are my options? Alyssa looked at the evidence, then at me. You can report him. She said, it is your legal duty as chairwoman, but if you do it today, the optics are messy. He will scream that you planted the evidence. Or I asked, or we give him a choice. Alyssa said. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out one final document. It was old. The paper was yellowed, similar to the prenup, but this one was sealed with heavy red wax. I recognized my mother's handwriting on the front. Addendum C, sealed, to be opened only in the event of litigation filed by Blake Sterling. I stared at the envelope. What is that? I asked. Your mother was a very thorough woman, Alyssa said softly. She knew Blake. She knew that if you ever left him, he would not go quietly. She knew he would sue. She knew he would try to take a piece of the company, so she prepared a contingency. Alyssa slid the envelope across the desk. "I have not opened it," Alyssa said. "I was instructed to keep it sealed until he filed a formal complaint. He filed it this morning." I reached out and touched the wax seal. My mother had been gone for months, yet here she was, still protecting me, still 5 steps ahead of the man who thought he was smarter than everyone. "Open it," I said. Alyssa picked up a letter opener. She sliced through the wax. The sound was sharp, like a guillotine blade dropping. She pulled out a single, handwritten letter and a flash drive. She read the letter silently. Her eyes widened. She looked up at me, and for the first time in our long association, I saw genuine awe on her face. "Mackenzie," Alyssa said, "you do not need to worry about the bank fraud. You do not need to worry about the press." "Why?" I asked. "Because," Alyssa said, holding up the flash drive, "your mother has been recording the board meetings for 10 years, not just the audio, the video, and she kept a personal log of every conversation she ever had with Blake at family dinners." Alyssa handed me the letter. "My dearest Mackenzie," the letter read, "if you are reading this, Blake has decided to fight. He has likely claimed he is the victim. He has likely claimed ownership of things he did not build. On this drive, you will find the proof of who he really is. I let him talk. Mackenzie, I let him brag. And I kept it all. I did not want to hurt him, but I refused to let him rob you. Give him a choice. He can have his pride, or he can have his freedom, but he cannot have my company." I closed my eyes. The path was clear. Call his lawyer. I said to Alyssa, "Tell them we are not settling. Tell them we are countersuing for fraud, embezzlement, and breach of fiduciary duty. And tell Blake," I added, my voice hardening into steel, "that I am willing to meet him, one last time, in the boardroom, tonight." I looked at the flash drive in my hand. "Tell him to bring a pen. He is going to need to sign one last paper." The legal motion arrived with the subtle grace of a brick through a window. Blake did not just sue for money. He sued for control. His lawyers filed an emergency injunction requesting that the court freeze my voting rights as chairwoman regarding any decisions affecting the Crestfall subsidiary, citing conflict of interest and malicious intent. He was trying to handcuff me to the table I owned. I sat in the judge's chambers for the preliminary hearing, watching Blake's new legal team operate. They were aggressive, loud, and theatrical. They painted a picture of Blake as a corporate martyr, a brilliant executive whose career was being strangled by a vindictive ex-wife. They argued that my sudden inheritance was a tool of abuse. Blake sat behind them, looking solemn. He wore a navy suit. His tie loosened just enough to suggest he was working hard under immense pressure. He caught my eye once and gave a small, confident nod. He believed the narrative. He believed that if he made enough noise, the board of Murphy Dominion would panic. He thought the old money behind the company would force me to settle just to make the headlines go away. He did not understand that the board was not afraid of headlines. They were afraid of fraud. I remained silent during his lawyer's opening tirade. When it was our turn, Alyssa did not shout. She simply placed a timeline on the judge's desk. It showed the date of my mother's death, the date of the probate closing, and the date of the asset transfer. Everything was legally watertight. "Your Honor," Alyssa said, her voice cool, "Mr. Sterling is asking the court to suspend the governance of a $150 billion conglomerate because he is unhappy with his performance review. This is not a legal grievance. It is a temper tantrum." Judge Caldwell denied the injunction immediately, but she set a date for the full hearing on the validity of the prenuptial agreement. Blake smiled as we left the chambers. He leaned in as he passed me. "See you at the office." "Mac," he whispered, "you cannot fire me while there is pending litigation about my employment status. It would look like retaliation." He was right about the optics, but he was wrong about the endgame. I returned to the tower and convened a special session of the board of directors. Usually, these meetings were held quarterly. I called this one with 3 hours' notice. The subject line of the invitation was simple: Risk Assessment, CRG, Leadership. Blake walked into the boardroom at 2 o'clock. He strode in with his head high, clutching a leather portfolio. He looked around the table, expecting to see a group of nervous, elderly investors he could charm. Instead, he saw faces he recognized and some he feared. Marcus, the head of legal, sat at the far end. Sarah, from audit, sat next to him. And then there were the three external directors titans of industry whom Blake had only read about in the Wall Street Journal. He froze for a second when he saw Arthur Vance, a man who controlled half the shipping lanes in the Atlantic, sitting to my right. Blake took the only empty seat at the opposite end of the long mahogany table. It was isolated, physically separated from the rest of us by 6 feet of polished wood. "Good afternoon," Blake said, projecting his voice. "I am glad we are finally having this conversation. I have prepared a defense of my tenure at Crestfall." No one spoke. Arthur Vance didn't even look up from his tablet. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Blake shifted in his chair. He looked at Marcus, searching for an ally. "Marcus," Blake said, forcing a smile, "you know my numbers. You know the growth I have driven in the Northeast." Marcus finally looked at him. His expression was not hostile. It was clinical. It was the look a doctor gives a patient who doesn't know they are terminal. "We are not here to discuss your sales figures." "Blake," Marcus said quietly, "we are here to quantify the liability exposure you have created for this firm." Blake bristled. "That is under litigation. It is under investigation," I corrected. I sat at the head of the table. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The weight of the room was doing the work for me. "Blake," I said, "you have filed a lawsuit claiming wrongful termination and fraud. You are demanding a settlement of $50 million and a reinstatement of your voting shares in the employee stock program." "That is correct," Blake said, straightening his tie. "And I will win, because a jury is going to hate the idea of a secret heiress playing games with her husband's career." I slid a thin folder across the table toward him. It slid smoothly over the varnish and stopped right at the edge of his hands. "That folder contains a draft press release," I said. Blake sneered. "You are going to badmouth me. Go ahead. It just helps my defamation case. Read it," I said. He opened the folder. He read the headline. "Murphy Dominion Holdings announces resignation of Senior Director Blake Sterling. Company declines to pursue criminal charges for wire fraud and falsification of banking records." Blake's face went rigid. He looked up, his eyes wide. "What is this?" "It is an offer," I said. I leaned forward, clasping my hands. "Blake, right now. You are a plaintiff in a civil suit. You are annoying, but you are not a felon. But the audit is complete. We found the riverfront file. We found the fake tenant leases. We found the shell companies in Delaware." Blake swallowed hard. I could see the sweat beading on his forehead. That was creative accounting. He stammered. "Everyone does it. It was necessary to get the loan. I did it for the company." "You committed bank fraud," Arthur Vance rumbled. His voice was like gravel grinding together. "And you implicated this board. If we do not report it, we are accessories." Blake looked at Vance, terrified. "Here is the choice," I said, keeping my voice soft. "You withdraw your lawsuit. You sign a voluntary resignation effective immediately. You waive all claims to severance and spousal support. You walk away with your freedom. And if I do not," Blake whispered, "if you do not," I continued, "then we are forced to defend ourselves in court, and our defense will not be arguments. It will be evidence. We will submit the riverfront file to the judge. We will submit the Tessa Monroe embezzlement logs. And once that is in the public record, the Department of Justice will pick it up." I paused. "You are worried about your reputation. Blake, think about how your reputation will look in a federal indictment." The room was silent. I watched him weigh his soul against his ego. I saw the logic fighting with the pride. Logic told him to run. Logic told him he was beaten. But Blake had spent 7 years convincing himself he was a giant. He could not accept that he was just a man standing on a trap door. He closed the folder. He pushed it back toward me. "You are bluffing," Blake said. His voice shook, but the defiance was there. "You will not destroy the company's reputation just to hurt me. If you expose the fraud, the stock price tanks, you lose billions." He smiled. A shaky, desperate smile. You need me to keep this quiet. Mac, that is my leverage. I am not resigning, and I am not dropping the suit. In fact, I am doubling the demand. I want 100 million, or I burn it all down. He stood up. See you in court, he said. He walked out. He thought he had just played a power move. He thought he had found the stalemate. He did not know that my mother had anticipated this exact moment of hubris. 2 days later, we were back in Judge Caldwell's courtroom. The atmosphere was electric. Blake's team was smug. They had filed a motion to compel discovery, demanding to see all of my private financial records. They thought they had me cornered between protecting the company's secrets and paying him off. Judge Caldwell took the bench. She looked tired. She looked at Blake with a gaze that was almost sorrowful. Mr. Sterling, the judge said, you have refused the settlement offer I have, Your Honor, Blake said, standing tall. I am fighting for what is rightfully mine, and you are insisting on proceeding with the claim that Mrs. Murphy deceived you regarding the nature of her assets and her role in the company. Absolutely, Blake said. She hid who she was. If I had known she was the chairwoman, I would have never signed that prenup. I would have never acted the way I did. I was kept in the dark. I looked at Alyssa. She gave a microscopic nod. Alyssa stood up. Your Honor, Alyssa said, since the plaintiff is making his state of mind and his knowledge of the defendant's family a central pillar of his argument, we move to introduce the final piece of evidence from the Evelyn Murphy estate. Blake's lawyer frowned. Objection. Discovery is closed. This is not new discovery, Alyssa said. This is a testamentary document that was sealed by this court. Pending the specific condition that Mr. Sterling filed a lawsuit against the estate or its beneficiary, that condition has been met. Judge Caldwell nodded. She reached for the large sealed envelope that had been sitting on the corner of her bench for the last week. The wax seal was still intact. Blake looked at the envelope. For the first time, a flicker of genuine confusion crossed his face. He looked at me. I was not looking at him. I was looking at the seal. Mr. Sterling, Judge Caldwell said, picking up a pair of scissors, your entire argument rests on the premise that you were an innocent victim of deception, that you were unaware. She cut the envelope open. The sound was loud in the quiet room. However, the judge continued, Evelyn Murphy left behind an addendum specifically addressing this scenario. She calls it the insurance policy. Blake took a half step back. What is in there? Judge Caldwell pulled out a thick stack of transcripts and a digital drive. She scanned the cover letter. It appears, the judge said, her eyes widening slightly as she read, that the late Mrs. Murphy was not just a silent partner, she was a meticulous archivist. The judge looked down at Blake. She recorded everything. Mr. Sterling, every dinner conversation where you insulted her intelligence, every phone call where you plotted to remove her daughter from the board, and most importantly, the judge held up a piece of paper, a signed acknowledgement from 7 years ago, the day before your wedding, where you declined a briefing on the Murphy Dominion corporate structure because, and I quote your handwritten note here, I do not care about her family's little business. I only care that she stays out of mine. Blake's face went white. He stopped breathing. He had forgotten. He had been so arrogant, so dismissive of the little business, that he had signed a waiver to avoid sitting through a boring legal meeting. He had signed away his right to claim ignorance. You signed it, the judge said, and in doing so, you did not just waive your right to the money, you waived your right to the lie. The judge turned to the court clerk. Open the evidence, she ordered. I watched Blake. He gripped the edge of the table. He realized, finally, that the ground beneath him was gone. He had not been fighting a battle. He had been digging his own grave for 7 years, and I had just handed him the shovel to finish the job. Judge Caldwell laid the contents of the envelope on the bench. It was not a single document. It was a dossier, thick and meticulously organized, bound with the same red wax that had sealed my mother's will. The room was so quiet that I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, a low drone that sounded like a held breath. Blake stood there, his hands gripping the back of the plaintiff's chair. His knuckles were white. He looked at the pile of papers with a mixture of confusion and dread, like a man watching a bomb technician cut a wire. "This is not just a waiver," Judge Caldwell said, her voice cutting through the silence. She picked up a heavy stack of bound pages. "This is titled The Shadow Log." She looked at Blake over the rim of her glasses. "Apparently, Mr. Sterling, while you were busy building your reputation at Crestfall, Evelyn Murphy was busy building a case study. She anticipated that a day might come when you would claim sole authorship of the company's success. So, she kept receipts." The judge handed the first section to the bailiff, who walked it over to Blake's table. "It is a comparative timeline," the judge explained. "On the left side are the handwritten notes from the confidential board meetings of Murphy Dominion, dated and notarized by the corporate secretary. On the right side are your internal memos, strategy pitches, and emails sent days, sometimes weeks, later." Blake looked down at the paper. I watched his eyes dart back and forth. "Exhibit A," the judge read, "dated October 4th, 3 years ago. Board member M. Murphy proposes a shift to suburban logistical hubs. Exhibit B, dated October 18th, 3 years ago. Senior Director Blake Sterling sends an email to the CEO claiming he has had a vision about suburban logistical hubs." The judge flipped a page. "Exhibit C, January 12th, M. Murphy outlines the risk of over-leveraging in the commercial sector. Exhibit D, January 15th. Blake Sterling gives a keynote speech warning about commercial over-leveraging, using the exact same phrasing." Blake's lawyer leaned in, whispering frantically, but Blake pushed him away. He was staring at the paper. He was seeing his own genius deconstructed, line by line, proving that for 7 years, he had been nothing more than an echo in an empty room. "It goes on for 200 pages, Judge Caldwell said, closing the file. "Every major decision you made, every strategic pivot you took credit for, it all originated in a room you were never invited to, from a woman you called irrelevant." Blake looked up at me. His face was gray. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow, haunting realization. He had believed his own lie. He had truly convinced himself that he was the architect. Now, looking at the timeline, he had to face the fact that he was just the bricklayer. "But that is not the only thing in the envelope," the judge said. Her tone shifted. It became colder, more dangerous. She pulled out a smaller, darker file. "There is also a section regarding the riverfront project." Blake flinched. The color drained from his lips completely. "My mother's note here says she flagged this transaction as highly irregular 6 months ago," the judge said. "She had her private investigators look into the tenant list." The judge looked at Blake's legal team. "Counsel, I assume you are aware that submitting a lawsuit based on the valuation of a career built on bank fraud opens your client up to immediate criminal referral. If this court validates his employment history to award damages, we also validate the crimes committed during that employment." Blake's lawyer froze. He closed his laptop. He looked at Blake, and then he began to pack his briefcase. "We need a recess," the lawyer said, his voice tight. "No recess," I said. I stood up. I walked across the aisle. Entering Blake's space, I stopped 3 feet from him. The bailiff moved to intercept, but I held up a hand. "There is no recess." "Blake," I said, "there is only a choice." I placed a single sheet of paper on the table in front of him. It was a settlement agreement. "Option A," I said, my voice steady and low. "We proceed. The judge enters the shadow log into the public record. The press gets hold of it. The Department of Justice gets hold of the riverfront file. You go to prison for 20 years for wire fraud, and everyone knows that the great Blake Sterling was a fraud who stole his wife's ideas." Blake looked at the paper. His hands were shaking uncontrollably now. "Option B," I continued. "You sign this, you withdraw your lawsuit with prejudice, you resign from Crestfall immediately. You sign a confession regarding the plagiarism to be kept in the company's internal sealed archives, correcting the record. And in exchange," Blake whispered, his voice cracking. "In exchange," I said, "I bury the riverfront file. I classify the fraud as an internal accounting error and absorb the loss. You do not go to prison. You just go away. Blake looked at me. His eyes were red, rimmed with tears of frustration and shame. You would do that, he asked. You would let me walk. I am not doing it for you. I said, I am doing it for the company. And I am doing it because my mother believed that mercy is a greater display of power than destruction. He looked down at the pen lying on the table. It was a cheap plastic pen, not the expensive fountain pen he had used to sign the divorce papers. He looked at his lawyer. The lawyer nodded. A sharp, single motion that meant, sign it or you die. Blake picked up the pen. He hesitated. He looked at the title of the document, Voluntary Resignation and Admission of Professional Misconduct. It was not just a resignation. It was an obituary for the man he thought he was. He signed. The scratch of the ballpoint pen on the paper was the only sound in the room. It sounded like a frantic insect trying to escape a jar. He signed his name, then dated it. He dropped the pen. It rolled across the table and fell to the floor. Judge Caldwell nodded. The suit is dismissed. She ruled. The record is sealed. Blake stood up. He looked smaller. The custom suit looked like it was hanging on a wire frame. He looked at me, searching for something, maybe anger, maybe forgiveness. I just wanted to be someone. He whispered. You were someone, I said. You were my husband. That should have been enough. He flinched as if I had slapped him. He grabbed his briefcase, not looking back, and walked toward the double doors. He pushed them open and disappeared into the hallway. A man stripped of his illusions, carrying nothing but the weight of his own mediocrity. I turned to Alyssa. She was smiling, a small, proud smile. She squeezed my hand. It is over. Mackenzie. I nodded. I picked up the dossier, my mother's final gift. I held it against my chest for a moment, feeling the solid reality of it. I walked out of the courtroom. The hallway was flooded with white afternoon light streaming through the high windows. It was blindingly bright, washing out the shadows, washing out the gray moral ambiguity of the last 7 years. I took a deep breath. The air tasted clean. It did not smell of old paper or lies. I checked my phone. I had a meeting with the board in an hour. We had a company to rebuild. We had a culture to fix. And for the first time in my life, I was not walking into that room as a proxy, or a shadow, or a wife. I was walking in as myself. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. As the doors closed, shutting out the courthouse, I whispered one word to the empty car. Done. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. So please drop a comment below sharing your city or country. It is always amazing to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed watching Blake finally face the music, please make sure to subscribe to the Leona Revenge Stories channel. Hit that like button and smash the hype button to help this story reach even more people who need a little justice in their day.